Hello, Doomloopers, and welcome to another episode of the Doomloop Dispatch, the show that covers the worst parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm your host, Kevin L. Jones, and with me whenever possible is...
D. Scott Miller. Glad to be here.
Yes, I am glad you're here too.
Oh, thanks.
And today we have... I guess I would say like a San Francisco legend.
Yes,
honestly.
sir.
Yeah,
yes,
a
sir.
San Francisco legend, really. Like, especially when it comes to, he was anti-tech before that was even a thing.
Yeah. And also, I mean, like, I also like to add, like, I'm really excited to have Chris because not only is he a historian on San Francisco and a lot of the things that actually like changed over the course of the time that I've been here, but he's also history himself. So, I mean, it's just really an honor to have Chris Carlsson. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, you're both far too kind.
Yeah, this is really exciting, honestly, especially after going through the Processed World archives and everything else.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah, totally. But first, let's get into your relationship and history with San Francisco, Chris.
Sure. Well, I mean, I got here in '78. Actually, I was on the very first day of 1978. I moved in, and I was born in New York and lived in Chicago till I was 10, and then I got to Oakland when I was 10 years old. And so I had my first experience in San Francisco was actually in 1967 at age 10 when my parents were house hunting. They dropped us off with some friends in a little apartment on Guerrero Street, a typical, Victorian flat on Guerrero between 18th and 19th. And I had this distinct memory of being, 10 years old and hanging out with my friends who I'd known from Chicago and going over to Dolores Park. And there's this beautiful green park and it had a train running through it. And I was just like astonished because I was living on the south side of Chicago where everything was dirt, gray and cement and soot and just like, harsh Chicago situation. So that was kind of a moment of excitement. And I remember also quite strongly because it turned out that the father of that family ended up being a wobbly and kind of an anarchist, which I didn't even know until many, many, many years later when I was briefly associated with the IWW myself. And so Skip Ashby was the father of that family. I mean, he did the classic tune in, turn on and drop out moment there in '67. And so their radio was on full time all day long, KFRC Top 40. And the main song playing over and over and over again was the Jefferson Airplane. Don't you want somebody to love? So that was the beginning of my San Francisco moment. But then we quickly moved to Oakland. My parents found a place in North Oakland, and I ended up going to public schools in Oakland and growing up basically in adjacent to Black America because that was where we were. And that was typical of my life in Chicago as well. So it was very odd for me when I went to college in Sonoma State briefly to enter white world. Like what is this?
Especially Sonoma too.
Yeah,
I didn't like it. It really was weird and disconcerting to say the least. But then I ended up moving back to San Francisco in the first '78. It's a kind of many stories that I'm leaving out about my life up there, but brief references to the anti-nuclear movement that I started to participate in during that time, the discovery of anarchism when I traveled to Europe in '77. Then I got fired from a bookstore for trying to start a union, and I ended up here in San Francisco on the first of '78, and I was canvassing for the first 6 months. But I moved into the Haight-Ashbury when it was 50% boarded up, the upper Haight.
Yeah.
And there was a heavy heroin and alcohol scene and violence and guns and knives and everything. And it was a remnant of what had happened because of both the combination of redevelopment and the earlier effort to build a freeway through the Panhandle, which I learned about much later. I didn't know anything about that when I moved in. But at that point, the Haight-Ashbury was still mostly 50-50 black and white, and Page Street was entirely African American owned from the park all the way to Market Street. I mean, that's what it was.
Yeah.
So I felt at home immediately, like, oh yeah, this is kind of where I belong. And then from then, I watched gentrification take off really quickly in the late '70s and beginnings of the '80s there, and ended up starting Processed World magazine with a bunch of friends because again, leaving out a lot of stories, but there was this radical group that I got connected to through a flyer they were handing out, and then they were called the Union of Concerned Commies. And so we ended up at some point we had a 6-month run as a street theater group, and we're decrying the left as much as the right. We had I was playing the role of Boob Faden and Vane Honda, and we were attacking those guys in the campaign for economic demagoguery. And we had a reactionary Communist Party member, with representing Chairman Moo, and so on and so forth. But we also were mostly talking about, the idiocy of that moment in American history where, because it started with a brainstorm. I said, why don't we just declare martial law and get it over with? It was already at that point, America held hostage day 216, and every night, bang, bam, bam, over and over again, this raising the tensions with Iran. So that was the period when Carter was still the president. We were quite sure there's no way the country could go further right than Jimmy Carter. He was so far to the right already. He was the first neoliberal president who was deregulating everything and opening up the markets and turning to the logic that the market was the answer rather than the state. Right. And he had been, came in on the backs of the unions and the left in 1976, but it turned on them right away, much the same as every Democrat since, as you can expect the next one.
Yeah, I've heard this story before.
Yeah, it's kind of a boring and repetitive tale at this point in our history. And so when Reagan, we thought Reagan was just a bumbling idiot, just a buffoon. There's no chance in hell that he could be elected. And then when he won, it was like, what? This isn't. Then, of course, immediately his popularity fell into the tank. He was like 15% popularity. And then they shot him. Hinckley shot him. Then he was grandpa. Oh, my God. He's the greatest hero of our time and blah, blah, blah. That's why they just tried to redo this with Trump, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So, in the end, our magazine, we were working on it, Process World, the first issue right then. Then the way it starts is that, me and a bunch of people like me looking at each other in the financial district and wondering, what the hell are we doing here? What I'm not an office. I don't work in banks. I need money to pay my rent, but I'm not sticking around here. This is just a temporary thing. And I was literally a temp working for Temp Incorporated. And I had gotten this incredible skill that I learned when I had a previous job, which was word processing, which doubled my wages from $6 to $12 an hour immediately. And so I was kind of cruising on that. $12 an hour in 1980 was pretty good money for a 22, 23-year-old. And so I was working downtown and looking around and seeing all these other people like me. And I was hanging out with this radical group and doing street theater and doing all these things. And I had this idea, why don't we start a magazine for people like us? Like, why do we always talk about somebody else's problems? Let's just talk about our own life.
Yeah.
And the reality of work. Who talks about that? It's the biggest public secret in our lives is work. Like, the stupidity of modern work is overwhelming. And the vast majority of work shouldn't be done at all.
Right.
Just stop tomorrow and the world would be a better place. Whether it's banking or insurance or real estate or advertising or military production. That's what do we need that for? Why we have all these things that are being produced that last 6 months instead of lasting for 75 years? What the hell? Who decided? Nobody. That's the problem. And I, spent a lot of time thinking about this over the years. And of course, I have a more hopefully sophisticated understanding of it today than I did back then. But even then, it was pretty clear that the fundamental relationship of wage labor, that point where you sell yourself to a job, that was the point where you gave up power over the world. You do what you're told or you don't have a job.
Yeah.
And so you behold to somebody else's agenda who is making a decision on what basis. Most of the people that you actually interact with are not making any decisions at all. They're in the same boat as you are, even if they're the manager or they get a high wage. So I finally, realized that basically we're all in the working class. Everybody, whether you're desperately poor living in a tent or you're making $188,000 going on a Google bus every week, you're still doing somebody else's work.
Yep.
You never are ever asked, what should we do or why should we do it? And that just does not enter the picture. And if you try to raise any questions like that, they're kind of like, what you mean? What are you talking about? You don't like your job? Well, go get another job. Do the job you care about if that's how you feel. It's like, well, that's irrelevant. It's not relevant. I want to change what we do as a society.
Yes.
The aggregate division of labor is the problem.
Yes, it is.
Not what I do. It's not what you do. It's not what any individual does. It's what we all do together. We get up in the morning, we make a mess.
Yeah.
We can make a beautiful world. We could get up today and start doing something completely different and actually take on the real issues that we face.
Yeah.
Well,
And so much of that too is with the elitism too. There's this class of people that thinks that's how it should be,
sure.
natural order and everything else. So then does that mean are you Christopher Winks? Are you the one who wrote the essay in the first processed world, that first article talking about being a temp worker?
I wish I wrote that well. No, Chris is a friend of mine. He lives in New York. He actually teaches at Queens College in Brooklyn, and now he's a professor of comparative literature. Then he was a bank worker, just like I was.
Oh, that's
So I have to say, like the first time I ever encountered Chris's work was I was working in a bookstore in West Virginia, and I had to be about 17 or 18 years old, and I ran across a copy of Process World, and it really did change the way I thought about like what I was doing, where I wanted to go, and what I wanted to be. Because I mean, like I'm just getting ready. I'm probably a freshman or a sophomore in college, and at the time I was actually going to go to law school. And it was through things like Process World and Autonomous Media and Temporary Autonomous Zones by Hakeem Bey. And I'm trying to remember this guy who actually had the Zero Work movement. Do you remember that guy?
Well, Zero Work was actual group, and Harry Cleaver, who wrote Reading Capital Politically, is still teaching. I think maybe he's retired now at the University of Texas at Austin. And the folks who ended up doing Midnight Notes were part of Zero Work. So Peter Linebaugh, famous historian, and George Kafensis and Sylvia Federici, who wrote Caliban and the Witch.
Yes.
All of these really brilliant people were all part of Zero Work, and they were connected to Italian autonomous markets who came out of the early 60s, who were the folks who first really started rethinking Marxism to put the onus on class struggle rather than the sort of the inevitable machinations of economic numbers leading to a financial crisis through rising composition of capital, blah, blah, blah. I can go into deep Marxism if you want. But, they said, no, that's bullshit. The crisis of capital is not created by a problem of numbers or a problem of, formulas. It's created by human beings who produce the world, who struggle over that production. And the idea that people at the workplace, and in the Italians, of course, started this in the 60s in the auto factories when they were just being implemented in Italy. And they were bringing all these Southerners up from Southern Italy to work in these auto plants. And it had these cultural, splits between the Northerners and the Southerners, and then all these different other things going on. And suddenly they started developing this new theory about the movement of the workers was what was putting pressure on the owners to change the structure of work, either through the implementation of technology or the speed up of the assembly lines or what have you. And the resistance to those changes was sort of the heart of what was class struggle. It's what opens up the possibilities for people to take control over their own lives. Right.
So that it was thoughts like that really made me change my major from law to journalism in English because I wanted to be a part of that movement and a part of that.
Damn it, you could have been a Supreme Court justice by now.
Yeah, maybe I should have done that shit. I'd be looking over at Clarence Thomas giving him the finger. I should have done
that. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Were you also involved with the Billboard Liberation Project?
Well, yeah. In fact, they just passed through with another moment of another group of people started a group called In Decline, and they're doing the same kinds of work that were the Billboard Liberationists were doing back in the day. I did my share of Billboard Liberation, but I wasn't formally a member of the Billboard Liberation Front. I don't know if really very many people were.
Can you explain what it is real quick? I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah, well, we all see these horrible billboards nowadays, mostly owned by Comcast or one or another giant companies. Used to be more independent.
Clear Channel, yeah.
Put them up on their, their building and own it and rent it out to, local advertisers, kind of where it starts, but it eventually gets consolidated into these large multinationals. And so, there they are staring you in the face, insulting you every day with their idiotic messages. And so many of us realize, like, well, wait a minute, I have a can of spray paint here, or I can make some letters and just change 2 letters on that thing is going to mean something completely different. And so, there's nothing unique to me. There's tons of people that did this before me and after me, and it's just a common response to I really consider it to be an intellectual insult. Yeah. To be living a life in which you're constantly bombarded by these really just inane messages. And so, turning things inside out, that's it. And then the best of the batch, the people that do it the best, sometimes actually worked for the billboard industry.
Wow.
In fact, the Billboard Liberation Front, formally constituted, one of them was actually in that industry and specialized even in neon signs at a certain point. And they would make sure to always bring either a 6-pack of beer or a 5th of whiskey and leave it on the billboard after they did their thing, so that when the workers had to come and fix it, they'd be rewarded for this extra work.
Well, see, that's beautiful.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were making a connection with the working, people that actually have to do all this stupid work on both sides of this thing. But yeah, there's a lot of those out there. There's one guy was running around as the California Department of Corrections, which of course is the name of our pleasant incarceral bureaucracy here in California, but it's also was his moniker for changing billboards, which he was very good at and did that for quite a while. He used to send us nice glossy photographs that we'd publish occasionally in Processed World. We also published the Billboard Liberation Front manual. The first time it was ever published was in the pages of Processed World. So
yeah. I always knew there was a connection. I just never knew what that connection was. Yeah, I mean, like, you're saying people are still doing it. Are they doing it now with the Comcast signs even now? Are they?
Oh yeah, no. In fact, there was just yesterday or day before in the San Francisco Gazetteer, which I'd never heard of until then. Their Instagram account posted some images of somebody that's a really good job on billboards in the bus shelters. So people have over the years gotten their hands on the keys to those big glass bus shelters, and they open them up and they put up full size, really high class, well designed alternative posters, and sometimes they go up kind of unnoticed for a while. But in this case, they put up a picture of that guy who set himself, the Air Force guy who
Aaron Bushnell.
Yeah. And then they had a sort of this memorial to Aaron Bushnell, honoring him for doing that, and then talking about what's going on in the war in the Middle East right now. So that went around a bunch of bus shelters over the last few days.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, so the move is still going on. That's really encouraging.
Yeah, it's going to go on as long as there's billboards, I guarantee you.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, yeah, I mean, so did you have any inkling of what this kind of tech world, especially in San Francisco, was going to turn into? Especially, I mean, did you see any of these power hungry techies, these guys that want to start their own gulches here in the city and stuff like that? Did you have any inkling that stuff was going to come around?
Well, I think we understood that there was something profoundly alienating about the experience of this restructuring of modern work on the basis of computing. That was our early experience, and that was what we were referring to. In retrospect, we have to say, Process World starts in really intellectually in 80, and then 81 is the first issue comes out when Reagan has just taken office. And we were at what was both the dawn of the information age and the dawn of neoliberalism. Right. We were a little clearer about the information age side of that, and a little less clear about neoliberalism as this larger reorganization of capitalism and counterattack on whatever the successes were of the 60s and 70s at changing the logic of capitalism. They were pretty quickly overcome by the counter revolution of the 80s and 90s, and carrying on to the present. So that was something we kind of got better at understanding as time went on, but not nearly as well as we might have. And so the idea that there was going to be this kind of incredible redistribution of wealth from most of us to a very, very tiny number of people, that was not easy to see or predict. That everybody thought there was, guardrails in place, that the state would be more actively engaged on behalf of the larger percentage of the population to prevent that level of skewing. But instead, it became the main entity which facilitated it. That's because of state capture. I mean, they've captured every aspect of the state. If you're familiar, there's another podcast going on right now by David Sirota at the Lever.
The master plan.
That's very good, because it actually shows you the step-by-step process of making it legal to have a completely corrupt government. And the Supreme Court and we have a government of millionaires buying for millionaires. It's been that way for quite a while, but now it's just like in your face. It's like, and it's going to stay that way forever, and that's how it's supposed to be. And everything's for us, and fuck all the rest of you. And it's like, oh well, I guess that's the world we got to live in now, huh? Okay.
No.
No, I've been listening to that podcast, and the one thing when they're talking about the Supreme Court justice, when he has a party after he's been inaugurated, and they give him a judge's robe with sponsorships with corporate brands on it, and they were saying it was a joke, but he was like, that was my favorite present. That made me so happy that you gave me this.
Wow.
Yeah, they're definitely all on the same team, that's for sure. And, that whole logic of bits and pieces of you for sale, that's exactly the world we're in.
Yeah. And so also too, it's been so shocking. How do you feel now about the internet? Because you've been using it for blogging, you can obviously see its power and what it can do for good, but clearly now there's some issues going on too. How are you feeling about how it's involved, especially in terms of misinformation? And has it made you kind of rethink at all how the internet should be handled?
Well, I haven't really ever been very enthusiastic about the internet as it's been evolving. My early experiences with it, email prior to the World Wide Web was one thing, and then as the web began to appear in my life, it was actually, one of the side stories here is critical mass, the big bike movement.
Yes, sir.
Which I had a lot to do with helping start. I was one of many people who did that, and then of course it recreated itself on its own through memes over and over again throughout the world. So the over 300 or 400 cities have had major bike movements based on that logic, which starts right here in San Francisco in 1992. And in 1992 was the beginning of the World Wide Web. We hardly even used it yet. Nobody even knew what it was. A browser, what's a browser? And hadn't really figured that out yet. So a year later, after snail mailing out how to do critical mass and doing all this stuff, I started seeing, things that I wrote. Actually, it was more like 94. Translated into French and appearing on a website in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm like, what is this? And so, I started to realize, okay, well, it's just it does have a new dimensionality. There's something new that has opened up here that's kind of exciting. Meanwhile, all this blather was going on about interactive multimedia is going to change everything. And, that was when we started Shaping San Francisco, the history project, that today takes the form of our digital archive at FoundSF.org and a whole bunch of programming that we do that you can find out at shapingsf.org. But the idea at the time was that everything was going to be delivered on CD-ROMs, and it was at that point in 95 and 96. You'll remember the sound of the modem connecting. That was a happy sound for a little while because it meant you could get online and get your email and they'd see something, briefly that was very chartreuse or magenta or whatever it was at those days with the text going across the entire screen.
Yeah.
So it took a while for people to figure out how to use all that stuff. And I knew early on that, a lot of what was going to happen was commercialization, but I didn't, nobody could foresee precisely the steps that were going to happen. Even as late as the early 2000s, before Google fully committed itself to, commercial advertising, it still seemed like there was room for a bunch of the internet to be non-commercial.
Yeah.
Be outside of that realm and be actually, I was just reminding myself that we're on the cusp of the 25th anniversary of Seattle, of WTO.
Yeah.
That was an exciting time. I was there and it was just like, oh my God, who knew this would succeed, A, from a protest point of view, and B, that was the dawn of, the, what was it called? Independent media centers and the indie media.
Yes.
And that felt so fresh, like, oh, okay, we've got ahead of it. Like we who have a better idea about things are actually using this technology before the assholes have taken it over.
Right.
And in some ways, Shaping San Francisco, our project was based on that same logic. We started working on our project in 95, 96, and originally it was going to be a game, which was everything was that was the era of Myst and Sim City, and it felt like, okay, this is where we have to go. And so we started working on it for 18 months. We were trying to create a game where you were a bike messenger, you made a pickup, and you go down the hall, and you get in the elevator, and then the next big earthquake strikes. And we animated this whole thing on a PC, believe it or not. And then so you're in the elevator, and it's shaking, and the doors open, and you've been knocked into the past, and how to make your way back to the present by solving problems in San Francisco history.
Oh, great.
It sounds great for a second, but let me tell you, if you think about it for 15 minutes, you realize, like, this is stupid. mean, partly I'm not a big gamer. Okay, so that's one thing. I just can't hold my suspension of disbelief for very long. But the truth of the matter was that the history itself was already so complicated and lent itself so well to a nonlinear way of thinking about it and presenting it, that itself is an incredible challenge. Like, what is the user interface? How do you make sense of hyperlinks? How do you make sense of popping wherever you want to go? Where's the narrative thread here? Is there a narrative thread? Is it true that the reader is the writer?
Right.
As you read, you are creating your own narrative thread. Is that a writing experience? Well, some people argue that's what it was back then. So we were at the cusp of that stuff in 95, 96, 97. And then we finally finished our $1 million piece of software that we built for free with no wages and rolled it out in 98, beginning of 98 at the library. We had a huge crowd of 300 people, and we had a series of public kiosks because we understood that interactive multimedia was a misnomer. Like, that was basically trying to say, when you talk about you and a computer, it's glorified multiple choice in a box. That's all it is. It's never more than that. But there is an art form here that's a new way of doing communication, new way of even approaching questions of epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we gain knowledge? How do we even trust what we learn?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean for that project? And that sort of speaks to the larger question of the internet. Like, all of these things came out at the same early moment, and we're trying to figure out how to use this new way of organizing knowledge and information and communication in ways that would change how we understand ourselves in the world. Not for the better, as it turns out, because as things evolve, of course, the commercialization instincts are quite profound. And though some of us have maintained completely non-commercial experiences online for this entire time, we are completely invisible to most people. I mean, FoundSF, our history archive, gets tons of use. That's great. And it's completely commercial free. It's entirely supported by small donations from people. We don't have any big sponsors or anybody dumping. We operate on an incredibly shoestring budget. It's just two of us to do everything. But my blog, for instance, went from having thousands of readers to just barely 100 over the years, because it's not in the walled garden of Facebook. It's not in the walled garden of Instagram. It's not it's not coming up on Google searches as a first thing, because I don't give a shit about that stuff.
Right. I mean, and I think you're making a good point there, because I mean, like, it seems to me that we did for a while be able to rend the means of production, especially in this new technology, for a small while. And what they did was they did build these social media structures in order to block off that wall. I mean, once again, the access is pretty much back to the billionaires now.
Yep.
I mean, and I mean, as far as, like, one of my favorite books ever is Reclaiming San Francisco. That is one of my favorite books ever. I mean, and because it does look at San Francisco history and the history of technology and the history of, I mean, like, San Francisco and the Bay Area is the seat of, in a whole lot of ways, of these really anti-radical changes, if you want to call them that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, can you talk a little bit about Reclaiming San Francisco? But even more than that, I mean, like, how can we reclaim now? How can we reclaim now?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. Of course, probably too big for me or any one human being to answer it properly, but I'll give a stab at it. Reclaiming San Francisco, the book, was developed in part. I worked with Jim Brooke and Nancy Peters at City Lights.
Yeah.
While we were in the middle of these very late nighters from all of our part of 96, 97, doing ultimately a CD-ROM and a series of public kiosks. And the kiosk, we wanted to have intelligent material. And we knew that we didn't really have a phalanx of history writers that we could just take advantage of. And so the idea was, let's do a book full of essays and then use excerpts from the essays on the digital side. And that'll give us some real serious content. And that's basically worked out. That was what we did with all that stuff. But the essays themselves are really good and standalone.
Amazing.
And that's largely thanks to Jim Brooke, who had a great vision for what that book should be. And Nancy, too, a great editor.
Yeah,
and I played a role, but I mean, I think I give them the lion's share of the credit for the actual high quality of that book. I have an essay in there that has held up well over the years. That's about the history of the Longshoremen's Union, going from the very radical moment of the 34 strike and how they get co-opted through history And by the 1960s, they become, part of the establishment in the city. And they've also by then signed the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement of 1960.
Yep, Harry Bridges.
Key technological concession that gives control over the process of moving goods in and out of the port back to the owners, where the workers had taken it through direct action for 25 years.
Yeah.
And so when they gave it back to the owners, of course, that was the beginning of containerization. And the container is the physical means of exploiting cheap labor throughout the world. You can't have cars built in multiple locations around the world if you can't put all those pieces into a 20-ton box and move the box very quickly. So the longshoremen themselves understood that, and Herb Mills was the head of Local 10 here, and we have some interviews with him on our website about that whole process that they're really worth looking into. So anyway, that's just one of many essays in that book that give you a different understanding of some of the common cliches about San Francisco and its radicalism. And you understand that, there has always been a cultural impulse toward that. And it's recurrent even to the present to some extent. It's still a little bit in the DNA here, a little bit in the physical environment, a little bit in the cultural heritage and the experiences of people who have lived here for a long time. And then it's also part of what we tend to refer to as the soul of San Francisco draining away. Like we can feel it diminishing over time because of what's happened with, recurrent waves of tech bros and tech booms and whatnot. But anyway, the Reclaiming San Francisco book then is part of this larger project, and then we did two more books in the wake of that with City Lights. One was called The Political Edge, which came out of the Matt Gonzalez insurgent mayoral campaign, which I wasn't that excited about, but
and he kind of sold out too. I mean,
he was. If you looked at his program, then he was playing the game that all politicians and particularly starting with Reagan do, which is just winking and nodding, like, "Don't worry, I won't say anything specific, but you can trust I'll do what you think I'm going to do."
Right.
Which is what they try to do that over and over. Harris is doing it now.
Yeah.
And so, it's just an old game, and it never really amounts to anything. And he was an austerity guy. He was going to be impose austerity. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That was old news.
Yeah.
And then we did another book in 2011 called 10 Years That Shook the City, San Francisco, 1968 to 78, which is a really great collection of essays from people who mostly lived through those social movements of that incredible decade, which, we talk about the 60s. Sometimes we talk about the 70s, but it was really this curious, you always have to arbitrarily pick dates when you do these kinds of things. So we picked 68 with the San Francisco State strike as the beginning of the book. And then we ended in 78, which is, when Moscone and Milk were assassinated and the Jonestown horror took place. And so we wanted to, sort of bookend it with those things. But the fact is that these incredible social movements that erupted during that time have everything to do with the quality of life that we have today.
Yes.
And it turns out other social movements that preceded it also, like the Freeway Revolt and the Save the Bay movement and the anti-nuclear movements, all of these things are why we like living in the Bay Area. And if those hadn't happened, it would be another story altogether. I mean, the Bay was supposed to be a wide river by now. In 1960, the Army Corps of Engineers published a map that showed that the entire South Bay was filled to the realm that the Bay was just a wide river and running down the middle of it. And that was what everybody thought was normal, making land. It stunk. It was awful. It was full of raw sewage and industrial waste. And why would you want to have this water body out here just like a big sewage pit? And nobody wanted to spend any time near the water because it was awful and it stank. And it's like, make land out of it. It's taxable. You can build warehouses and houses, and we need more housing, right? That's what they keep saying.
Yeah.
So that was the drill back then, and it was thanks to a movement that starts with three rich ladies in the hills of Berkeley, and then them having the wherewithal to really create a movement that turns 2 years later into the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is did its job unbelievably, a regional agency that actually did its job and prevented the filling of the bay.
Yeah.
And then the Clean Water Act, like nobody remembers this, but it wasn't until 1971 that we started having proper sewage treatment. Up until then, you know what sewage treatment was? They'd put a chain link fence across the outflow to catch dead bodies and logs. Otherwise, raw sewage poured into the bay. Every municipality, not just here, but every waterway in America. That was normal until 1971 when the Clean Water Act passes. That will be normal again if Trump comes in and guts the Clean Water Act like he wants to, right?
Yeah, true.
So, that's not this big pick for Harris. Who cares? It's just status quo is just as bad, but that's worse.
Yes.
That's worse.
I completely agree. And I gotta say too, I mean, how did you, I mean, because that's the thing too. It's like, I'm not excited to vote for Harris, but I have to. But because to me too, she also signals that switch when she beat Terrence Hallinan for DA and came in being like, let's bust those pot smokers. And, I mean, really, like, just on the neo-lib side, that really kind of switched everything. I mean, how did you feel about her at that moment?
Oh yeah, same as you. I mean, she was horrible right from the get-go, and represented this kind of like, well, she's part of the Brown machine, right? She was, very close to Willie Brown at a key moment in her life, and that doesn't mean he controls her, but there's a kind of a logic that Brown is still in the heart of and has been all along, and London Breed is his person, and the Burton Brown machine, Nancy Pelosi's part of that. They're all part of it, and the idea that these people are called left on the American political spectrum is just completely bizarre to me. Like, I can't understand how they get away with it.
Yeah.
Like, they're not even remotely to the left. There has never been a left-wing mayor of San Francisco. Art Agnos is the closest one, and he was, and Moscone before him, but they both had the similar problems. They both come out of the state Senate, and they get to be mayors, and then as soon as they become mayors, they waffle to the right the whole time and end up doing very little.
Well, I mean, to me, it's the absolute acquiescence to the bullying of the right. Like, I mean, so I mean, that's the whole problem. The real problem is just like nobody's really stood up to the bully.
Yeah.
Like that's really what the issue is. So I mean, to me, it's just kind of like nothing's really going to change unless we actually acknowledge the fact that the bully is the person who's framing the conversation.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to change. I mean, like,
well, I mean, to cut to the chase on that, I mean, yeah, they're bullies, but it's not just they're mean. They actually control capital. And if capital threatens to strike, which is what they use as their leverage, that's how the bully gets its way. It says, hey, you do what we tell you to do, or we're taking our ball and we're leaving. We're just going to take all the business and go elsewhere, and you're going to be starving. And they never will, but that's their threat. And so the politicians feel like, oh, like Ed Lee, I'll give you a Twitter tax, and you could please, I beg you, stay here and build more businesses here, and it'll be everybody will benefit.
Conway.
Yeah, but also, but then that whole idea. I mean, I've just finished talking to someone about Walmart. I mean, I'm from West Virginia, like I said, and Walmart has gutted entire communities.
Yeah.
I mean, last time I went back to West Virginia, there were places, just business centers, like local grocery stores, local drug stores, local clothing stores. But Walmart comes in there. Walmart undercuts everything in that little small community, and then Walmart is the drugstore. Walmart is the gas station. Walmart is where you get your clothes. Walmart is where you get your groceries. And so, like, all these other places have been devastated, and yet they're still begging for Walmarts in West Virginia. They're still begging for them. I mean, that contradiction is just astounding to me. Why would you beg for people to come in and deplete your local resources? Like, why would you ask Twitter to come in and just totally like whitewash your entire city? Please, Twitter, please come and destroy my city, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a model that they imagine is economic prosperity, and it is for some people, right? There's some people who feel like, oh, this is good. Life is good now. I live in the Mission. I've been here since '87, and this is a neighborhood that has been gentrified rather heavily during those decades. And maybe I'm part of that. Even originally moving in here, I helped buy a place on Potrero Avenue back in '87. That was when I first got here. It was a 4-unit building that 4 couples bought together, literally, and moved in together. And then all hated each other soon after. Property does in fact destroy everything. That's what we can say with confidence about all of these situations. But the idea that there's a prosperity that's good for everyone, if it's good for the people at the top, is the fundamental falsehood that they keep peddling. And there's certainly going on in today's election. There's, I don't know if you saw the Michael Moritz piece in the New York Times yesterday about
Peskin.
Oh my God, that's just so ridiculous. It was hard to even tolerate that. I can't believe they published it, let alone
Well, they also hired Heather Hit Piece Knight too.
which I think was probably where they got the access. I think that's where Morris got the access. It was probably through Heather Knight. That's my
serious.
That's my
probably true. Anyway, but that the fight for I don't know, Aaron. I've known Aaron for a long time, even before he was elected for anything, and I trust him. He's not corrupt, like that for sure. He's not a corrupt dude. He's never going to be on the take with anybody. But I also don't totally trust that he would do what I wanted to do all the time. But what do I don't expect any politician to do that. So I would hope that he might sneak in and get elected. But with ranked choice voting, it's possible. But it's the odds are against him, I think, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's so much money. I mean, it's so insane that the millions being poured in this stuff. Millions being poured just to take over, clubs that give endorsements. I mean, that was insane, like that kind of stuff.
They seem to think there's a lot at stake in running San Francisco. And there's certainly, I don't know if you've been following Gil Duran's really good work.
Yes. Yeah. We've interviewed him on the show.
Oh, good. Yeah. That's such a brilliant turn of phrase, the nerd Reich.
Yes. Yeah.
It's actually perfect. It's perfect.
Yes, seriously. I know.
And unfortunately, it's real, too. Like these people are fascists. And
oh, my God.
They do want to run the world on that basis, a little bit different model than Hitler, but many things.
Yeah, and the thing is too is they're kind of highlighting too a really interesting point about where you were talking about the dynamics of the real estate and the rich, especially like real estate. You want us to come in, you want to do stuff, do these things for us. You have to do this, you have to do this. Like they taught in Oakland with Jerry Brown when he came in, when no one bid on his Ecopolis, I guess as you say, Ecopolis. He's just like, screw it. Hey, real estate guys, what do you want? Oh, well, we want a harsher police state, increase police, and that's kind of like you see that over and over again. But now you're getting the police making their demands too. The police unions have gotten so powerful. They're the ones go like, well, we don't want this DA because he's going to come after us, and that kind of thing.
That's the same thing's happening like in Oakland with Pamela Price too. I mean, and I'm like, these days a third of most cities' revenue is going to the police departments. I mean, like we are seeing like it's a rise in like what you were even pointing at in Process World back in the 80s. Like it's a rise of a certain kind of corporatism that's meeting kind of like this new militarization of capital, right? Like so now the network state tech bros are trying to buy the cops to protect their private property, to protect their network state, and so like it's kind of like corporate America and tech have aligned with a certain kind of militarized mentality. And I mean, I'm curious to know how the hell is like how are humans supposed to be acting right now? Like, what are humans supposed to be doing? I mean, that's the question I'm asking myself, because it's starting to become very clear that this shit is pretty much just like an armored ball of hate that's just rolling towards us. Like,
well, I mean, I think there's some things to be said that there's a few different items I wanted to touch on really quickly. One thing is that this rise of the military state that's in us and amongst us is a direct result of being an empire, a military empire in which we were bombing the shit out of the rest of the world with impunity for ever since World War II. Has never stopped. It even was going on long before that. If you go back to the Philippines and some of these other things, so that war has come home fully, and it's here, and it's the world we're going to have to deal with. And so, what are the human responses to that? Well, first of all, there's a political agenda, which for me is the abolition of money and the abolition of wage labor, which just sounds like I'm a nutcase out in left field, and nobody can understand what that even means. Wage labor is the air I breathe. Like that's all I can know. I need a job. Fuck you with your stupid, abstractions. I understand, but that is actually the answer. So, but putting that aside for the moment, an interim answer, which is why they have tripled down on the military state at home, is the only thing we can do is take their fucking money. Like that's the answer politically. Yeah. There's no other political agenda that makes any sense. Just take their fucking money. Nobody's allowed to own more than $1 million. Period. Yeah. And after that, it's all taken away from you, and it's used for the general well-being to produce a commonwealth.
Yes.
High quality, luxurious public parks, high quality, luxurious public education, high quality, luxurious universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. All that should be available to everybody all the time, period, end of discussion. Great housing for everyone. Luxurious housing with fine gold-plated plumbing. I mean, And the plumbing system has to change in every single building because we use water like idiots in California, which is the edge of a desert, and it's going to be more desertified in the very near future. We have to change how we use water. So that means you have to replumb every house.
Yeah.
Stop taking a shit in drinking water. How dumb is that?
Yeah. And
like
also not use it to cool down server farms either.
Well, yeah, not to mention. So yeah, there's a million things like that. The fundamental thing boils down to take their fucking money.
Yes.
Like, don't let them make decisions. Don't let them have the power to coerce politicians and political administrations at all levels with their capital. Why do we let them have it? They haven't, and that's why they've heavily militarized, because they're going to defend to the death their right to control everything through their control of wealth. So that's the big deal. Now, as human beings, what do? Well, mutual aid and solidarity, more cliches, but nevertheless quite real in everyday life. If you don't have people who you can turn to in your community who can take care of you and you take care of them, it's pretty hard to survive. So most of us do in fact have networks of support, and potentially those are easy to grow rather rapidly, as we saw during COVID, when everybody suddenly were posting on polls all over the neighborhood. Do you need help? Here's a phone number. Call here. I'll bring groceries to your house if you're stuck inside. If you can't get up and down the stairs, call me. I'll help you. I saw dozens of those kinds of posters around this neighborhood within 2 days, within a week or two of the shutdown back in COVID. And that's why I like living here, is because I feel like when the shit hits the fan, and it's flying at the fan as we speak.
Yeah.
I think there's a higher chance of people working it out together here than in a lot of other places, because finally the culture of San Francisco is relatively cooperative, relatively trusting, relatively open-minded and tolerant compared to other places.
This is absolutely true. And also mutual aid and solidarity. I mean, I know, like you're saying, those are cliche terms to some people, but like, to me, it seems like a very effective strategy. Mutual aid and solidarity in the struggle is still a very real thing. Still very real.
And especially go on.
Just the book that I wrote that was published 15 years ago now, called Nowtopia.
Yeah.
That kind of grew out of my work in process world for all those years. So I was still thinking about work all the time. And I realized around that time in the first decade of the 2000s, I was like, I still believe in revolution, and I still think work is the crucial question, the fundamental piece of the story. And so how do we actually manage to, how do we know that that's still possible? Well, I started looking around and go, well, if it's true what I believe, which is that revolution is possible and that it would happen something to do with work, must be visible, must be actually something I can observe going on in the world. And so I started looking around and I go, oh my gosh, look at all these interesting projects that are going on everywhere. There's free software projects, there's the community garden movement, DIY bike shops, and what I call outlaw bicycling.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of projects that I was looking at. And I realized, like, wow, people, when they're not at their idiotic jobs trying to make enough money to pay their rent, they're actually in their other so-called free time, they're working. They're working really hard. And actually the things that matter, the things that actually address the world that we're in.
Totally.
Those projects continue today. I mean, it's still going on. It's not, I mean, I think I'm in some fundamental way I was wrong in the book, because I was arguing that the working class is recomposing itself using the autonomous Marxist language of class composition on the basis of work outside of wage labor, and that there would be a social movement that would recognize that that was deeply political activity, and that would challenge the larger logic of how of labor gets organized. I mean, it could still happen, but it hasn't.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get into, you mentioned critical mass and your involvement with that, and I do think that's a really important a movement as well, especially kind of showing people like there's other ways to get around and stuff. But now, as time is going on, and especially this, Michael Lewis talks about the big blob of money that's going around. It's so much more into real estate now. And I'm seeing, bike lanes and bike infrastructure being used as a form of gentrification. How do you feel about it? It's almost like, especially, with these kind of hard bike lanes and stuff, you talk to cyclists and they actually don't like them, but they sure do, increase property values and curb appeal.
Well, that's a great series of questions there. Critical mass starts off, it's very anarchic. It's really much about no leadership and just having its own kind of creating a public space in motion through the city on bicycles. And it was partly on bikes because, most of us who were cyclists in the late 80s and early 90s felt like second class citizens at best. And, people would go by us and yell at us, get off the road, get a job. Wait a minute, I'm going to my job or I'm going home. What are you talking about? I mean, I'm doing you a favor. I'm riding a bike. I'm not in a car clogging the street in front of you. You can go on your merry way. It's not my fault you're in traffic. So, we felt like, well, fuck that. Let's just get together once a month and ride in a group, and maybe something will happen that we displace the car. If we have enough bikes, there won't be room for cars. That would be cool.
Wow.
We didn't know it was going to work. And not only did it worked like gangbusters, and it led to this incredibly euphoric experience of being in the streets together with other people on bikes, and you're hearing the tinkle of bells, and you smell the city different, and you hear the city different, and you can never think about urban environment the same way again once you've had that experience. So it's incredibly important material experience for people to live through. But bicycling is only a thing. It's a choice of how to move through an urban environment. It's one of many transit choices, and transportation is one of many things about how we produce life. It's not the only part of life that matters. It's one, important, not nothing, but it's not everything. And so as time went on, the movement, if you could call it a movement, got, at least in San Francisco, very co-opted by the bike coalition, who deliberately kept us at arm's length, which we also said, yeah, we're not you and you're not us. Let's just, and they, in fact, for many years had an office directly across the hall from me in the Grant building at 7th and Market. So we kind of knew we were playing an inside-outside game with the larger world. And that reproduced itself in other cities to some extent, although some places were completely merged and other places completely different. So to make a long story short, as things went on, critical mass got more and more boring and less interesting and more repetitive and predictable. And then the people that were willing to go sit at the table with the bureaucrats of the transit agencies and the Department of Public Works and the city government, they take all the credit for the infrastructural changes, but there's no chance in hell any of those would have happened if there hadn't been a mass seizure of the streets every month for 15 years.
Wow.
The mass seizure of the streets is what gave them the political juice to get shit done.
Well, yeah. So basically,
like to admit that.
So it actually got co-opted by like corporate and bureaucratic forces. That's essentially what happened.
The bike coalition in particular made a deal, where they were out raising money all the time, and they happily received money from the tech companies and the developers who saw them as part of this new urbanism. And so you have movements that people who were associated with that stuff, who actually started an organization in San Francisco called the Housing Action Coalition. They also the ones who started the Zip Car movement and created the car sharing before Uber and Lyft and all that stuff. And then that group of people, I mean, here's a funny story. I mean, there's one person in particular I'll mention because he worked with us very briefly in Shaping San Francisco. He came in, he and his wife, later wife, and another friend, Kate, Gabriel Metcalf and Elizabeth Sullivan and Kate White came in and worked with Shaping San Francisco in 97. And he wrote a grant for us that didn't get funded, but that was what he tried to do. And then he later left, and he told me later that I was the problem in the group because they didn't see how they would ever grow if I was in the way, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. People can have their arguments. I don't have a problem with that. But later he ends up getting his degree, and he works for Spur. He becomes the head of Spur. And then later he goes off to Australia and does more urban planning. And now he comes back and he's hired by the tech bros to run that fucking project in Solano County. He's like the main designer of that. Yeah. Meanwhile, Kate and Elizabeth went off and started not Zipcar, but City Car Share.
Yep.
Which preceded Zipcar, right? And then Kate starts the Housing Action Coalition, which is now the voice of YIMBYism.
Yeah.
And so, curiously enough, these guys who had kind of lefty politics when I met them, and they were really, earnest young people looking to get involved in city stuff. That's the path they took, and they see that as progressive to this day.
Yep.
And so that's a really interesting thing to recognize, because then you realize that the bike coalition, who is mostly upper middle class people, as bicycling movements are everywhere throughout the world, people who do politics around bicycling are almost always middle and upper middle class people.
Yep.
They basically saw their natural coalition partners to be people who are doing these dense urbanization projects, because that's part of their vision. Is like, we should densify.
Yeah.
We should promote, urban densification and growth. And economic growth is not a problem. That's a good thing from their point of view.
Yep.
To me, obviously, is a problem. My view of the world. So ultimately, then I found myself in this odd position where I was invited repeatedly in the 2010s to come to South America for what became known as the World Bike Forum, the Forum Mundial de la Bicicleta, which starts in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in the year 2012, 1 year to the day after a banker drove his car through critical mass at full speed.
Oh,
because he was irritated that 200 bikes were in the street in front of him. And the bikes went flying off the hood of his car like the parting of the seas.
yeah.
And by a miracle, nobody was killed. Only one person had a broken bone. It could have been so much worse.
It's terrible.
But he needed to be prosecuted for that. And they were really frustrated a year later that wasn't happening. So they invited the world to come to Porto Alegre, which then launched this event. And I was there for the first one. I went for the third one. And then by the fourth one, they moved to Colombia. And then from then on, I was moving from city to city throughout South America. And I went to Santiago, Chile, and Lima, Peru, and Mexico City. And I gave these speeches there that the one that I kind of use as the anchor of this is because I started giving kind of the same speech over what felt like to me the same speech, which is kind of going down to warn them. So the one that I used that I think gets the point over the best is called, "If bicycling is the key, what does it unlock?" Because nobody as a bicycle activist wants to have that conversation. They just think bicycling is the thing.
Yep.
Everybody on a bike and we'll live in the paradise. I was like, well, go to Copenhagen, go to Amsterdam. That's not paradise.
Yeah.
Bicycling's great. Bicycling's better. I get it. I'm a bicyclist. I don't own a car. That's how I get around. I'm all for it. But if you think bicycling is some end in and of itself, you're wrong. So how can you develop a broader agenda while you have thousands of people excited about this that starts to connect bicycling up with other decisions we make as human beings living together in dense urban environments about how we relate to food, how we relate to water, how we relate to every communications, how we relate to the commonwealth, the common goods of our lives, whether there are any common goods at all. These are the bigger questions that need to be asked. And bicycling is a great way to open the window and you step through and you go, oh, look at all these other things we have to talk about. I forgot about that. I'm glad.
Right.
And that's what we did talk about in the early days of critical mass while we were riding down the street. We'd have major conversations about these items sometimes. I recall quite well. So
I think it's great that it actually started out as a mobilized temporary autonomous zone. I think that's just like I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I always thought it as a bike party, I always thought it as bike party. But no, actually, it was a public space, a mobile public space going through San Francisco. That's brilliant, man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's good that you mentioned bike party because bike party was invented to repudiate critical mass.
I believe it.
Yeah, it was actually invented first by the folks in San Jose. They were not so hostile to critical mass, but they just felt like we can't do that either.
Yeah.
Like our streets are super wide and it's like giant focus on car throughput, and there's not really a place at all in San Jose for bicycling.
Right.
So we're going to do a thing we call the bike party. We're going to stay in one lane. We're going to have monitors. They're going to have lights. They're going to flash them in your eye if you run a red light. We're going to control people, make sure they don't break the laws because we don't want to have the cops coming down on us. And so they created that. And we went down there and did support rides with them. And it was fun. And we got along. And they'd come up and love critical mass. They loved it. But then there's some folks in San Francisco who had taken a real strong dislike to critical mass who wanted to co-opt it. Exactly the same crowd we've been talking about, the neoliberal types who wanted the densification and urbanism and everything. They're like, critical mass, oh my God, it's so anarchic, it's so illegal, it's causing fights with people, and they're so violent. It's like, there's no violence. If you look at critical mass globally, my God, it's happened in hundreds of cities around the world for 2 or 3 decades. Nobody's ever been killed, ever.
Yeah.
There's hardly even been any fights. The only fights are when the police attack us. That's happened from time to time, but that's the only time. So it's so frustrating. But anyway, the bike party then has taken off, and and the East Bay bike party's become a thing of its own, which I can appreciate and enjoy the fact that it's had its own evolution, because it turned out that an awful lot of young people of color didn't feel very welcome at Critical Mass. It became identified for one reason or another. It wasn't really always like this, but it became very identified as a white event.
Well, that's because like San Francisco itself was actually starting to do that whole gentrification and the push out Black and brown people.
Pretty white.
So, I mean, like, it become like Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Like I respect and love Lawrence, but he did call it the white city on the hill. You know what I mean? He totally did. Okay, well, it's been an hour, man.
I wanted to say something real quick though too, because there's so many good points that you made, Chris, too, that I really have to really focus on, especially with biking and real estate and everything else too, because it has been co-opted. You find so many people that. Especially in the bike world, that's just like, oh, well, if we all bike, that solves climate change. But you're also right, too, to point out that, like, they cite things like Amsterdam and Denmark as, these, like, cities on the hill. This is what we should be. But then you find, guess what? The most expensive places to live, the highest rents in the world in those places, especially Amsterdam. I mean, it's seriously.
Yeah. And both cities are intensely Islamophobic and racist too. So
exactly. But it's so funny too, because like there is this kind of push, which we should be decreasing, the pollution that comes from personal vehicles. But at that same time, one, you have pollution is still going up thanks to server farms for AI and everything else, as well as densification. Construction costs or construction is actually literally undoing all the progress we're making by decreasing pollution from personal vehicles. But on top of that, too, who are the big investors in these bike movements like Walk Bike Berkeley and stuff like that? Lyft. Rideshare companies, they're totally the ones who like financing this stuff. They're the ones that were financing the congestion pricing in New York City. So it's just like I'm so glad to hear this from you, because to me it's like people aren't seeing how this co-opted movement is actually being used against the people.
It's actually amazing how many times you actually. Oh, go ahead.
There's several really good books that have been published over the last decade on this very topic. One's called Bike Lanes Are White Lanes. It's a very in-depth study of the gentrification process around bike lane infrastructure extension being used essentially to advance gentrification agendas. And then John Stalin's Stehelin, I forget the title of his book, but he's a really smart guy, and he wrote a great book about bike politics more broadly across urban America. So check those guys out.
Awesome.
Great. All right. This was awesome, Chris.
Yeah, man. Like, really appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. I've appreciated you for ever since I've been a teenager, man. It's an honor to have you on the show.
I feel honored that you feel that way. So
man. Like, no,
I
it's
also
really.
Probably admire your work; is quite remarkable. So,
yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're definitely going to want to talk to you more personally and as a show.
Yeah, sounds good. Anytime.
And also, I suggest to all our listeners and viewers go check out the Processed World website, especially if you want to have a time travel experience.
Absolutely.
It's still got that classic HTML 1996 look, which I just loved. I was like, oh my God, am I back at GeoCities? This is great.
GeoCities. And also check out SF Found, incredible website. Incredible resource, both for history and for philosophy and arts and culture. It's probably one of the stronger sites that independent sites are still around. So I totally recommend that. I'm always checking in.
And Chris's own blog, Nowtopians.
Yeah, Nowtopians.
So great too.
Yeah.
I was actually just looking through it last night. So much good stuff. I love you suggesting Palo Alto by Malcolm Harris. Such a great book that everyone should read. Yeah, seriously. And
most of what I've done on there for a while has been a lot of heavy book reviews and book essays about lots of things that I read. I spend a lot of time reading. I read books much more than I read anything else these days. So For those people who can't find the time to read a book, you can have a shorthand version by reading my blog.
Yeah, which is understandable in today's fast-paced world. But
Yeah.
so that's been it for Doomloop Dispatch. Thank you all for tuning in. Please follow us on our socials. You know, we're on X, we're on the TikTok, we're on Instagram, and please support us on Patreon and subscribe to us on YouTube. Until the next episode, everyone keep fighting the good fight.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.